Hello and welcome. We've now made it to video 6 in the 6-part series on the Protestant Reformation. And the focus of this final video is just going to be some of the big picture outcomes of the Reformation. Because even though this was specifically a religious reform movement for Christianity, it was not something that had simply a short-term impact or was a big deal at the time, but otherwise that was that. But this is something that has had an impact at the time, early 1500s, and has continued to have an impact ever since. So with that, I just want to touch on a few different areas in particular. Now, one thing about the Protestant Reformation is that it did lead to a much larger number, a number that's continued to grow over the years, a much larger number of Christian churches, not just in Europe, but around the world. If you look at the picture on the screen, you can see on the bottom left that at one point in time, and again, if you're focused specifically on Europe initially, that the Roman Catholic Church was the Christian church in Europe. And again, the term Catholic simply means universal, so it was the Christian church. Now, with Luther's 95 Theses and beginning to put his ideas out there that were challenging the church, that started the process of just an ever-growing number of particular branches of Christianity, starting with the Lutheran Church, which basically employed Luther's basic ideas. Now, if you looked at the Lutheran Church, especially in the beginning compared to the Catholic Church, you would have seen some key differences, but otherwise you would have seen a lot of how they operated as being very similar. Now, as time would go by, there would be different people and different circumstances that would come along that would lead to new branches of Christianity developing. For example, in England, you could argue that political reasons were as much of a reason to make a break with the Catholic Church as anything else. At the time, you had King Henry VIII, who ended up going through a series of marriages with one of the key goals having a son, out of a belief that the wife that he had was not going to produce a son. He sought a divorce that the Pope did not want to grant. As a result of that obstacle, used the British Parliament or the English Parliament to pass what was called the Act of Supremacy that made in England the king the head of the church in England, rather than the Pope being the authority over that. And as I'm sure you can imagine, if you're a king who's seeking a divorce that the Pope won't grant, if you can become the head of the church in the land where you live, then you get that opportunity. Another thing that the king was able to pick up in that example was all of the property that had previously been in the hands of the Catholic Church was now held by the king. So in the case of England and the development of the Anglican Church, you can argue that was largely politically driven. But over the years, you've seen a variety of different Protestant churches develop, and including non-denominational churches that are, in essence, just Christ-focused without necessarily a particular set of unique values that might be more specific to them, whether it's something like the Anabaptists, where they don't baptize infants but baptize adults, or any other particular thing that might be unique to a particular branch of Christianity. So in the world that we live in today, as it relates to Christianity, there are lots of different, very particular takes on it, where you have one group that may really emphasize a component or an aspect of Christianity that maybe another group doesn't place as much emphasis on. So at least as it relates to Christianity, someone who is interested in that faith certainly has some choices for the direction they can go with that. Now, if we look more back at the time and then moving forward, one thing that did really unify Europe prior to the Protestant Reformation was religion. So it didn't really matter if you were in Northern Europe, in Southern Europe, in Western Europe, different languages, many different cultural customs, maybe separated people. If there was one thing that united people, it was their common faith, the Catholic Christian faith. With the Protestant Reformation, that was no longer a unifying force. And that's not necessarily a good change or a bad change, but it was definitely a change. So the opportunity for different places and groups of people to veer off in different directions was greater than it had been before. And so it's probably no surprise that you begin to see more formal development of the countries that we're more familiar with today than may have been as true at the time before the Protestant Reformation. Another big area for change was how power was held in Europe, basically who had it and how much they had. If you look at the picture here, you see on the left, I've got the king depicted. On the right, I've got the Pope depicted. And in simple terms, the power of kings, individual kings throughout Europe went up. The power of the Pope went down. And power is one of those things that this is just my take on it. I tend to think that power, like there's a finite of power that exists. And so if power is going to go up somewhere, it's got to go down somewhere else. So it seems like a natural change that if the authority of the Pope goes down, there has to be an increase in power somewhere else. And the way that really played out was individual kings. And one thing that I didn't speak to in the earlier videos, one thing that was a little bit of maybe an interesting twist to the ability for people to choose their faith during this early time of the Protestant Reformation. So basically think 1500s, from roughly say 1521, moving through the rest of the century to at least the mid part of the century, to a large degree, whether you were a part of the Catholic Church or whether you were a part of like say the Lutheran Church, was up to your local leader. So if you had someone like a king who ruled over what might be a relatively small area, if you were a person living within that king's domain, it was basically up to the king to determine whether he and his domain were a part of the Catholic Church or breaking off from that. And so if the king broke off from that, you in effect broke off from that. So the people at the time didn't quite have the same choices that people today have. But that was definitely an area where a king might desire to break from the Catholic Church because it would be a great opportunity to increase their power. So overall, if you look across Europe, between the places that didn't break with the church and the places that did, the overall authority of the Pope did go down. The overall authority of individual kings did go up. And then just one last thing to speak to, kind of the big picture idea that this was definitely a step towards what we might think of as the modern world, whether it was places moving more to being the countries that we're familiar with today and developing their own individual leadership structures, no longer under simply the authority, the overall authority of a religious figure like the Pope, to continuing to usher in this age where people were beginning to question things more. Keep in mind the Protestant Reformation happened during the period of time that we refer to as the Renaissance. So it's not like these are separate events that happened in different places at different times. They were kind of one and the same. So this was a period of time, and religion was one of many things that people were beginning to ask more questions about. And through the questioning of traditional authority structures, through the questioning of what people had believed up to that point, you begin to see changes occur that usher in other movements that lead to more changes. Again, things that we associate with the modern world, like the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, a lot of how we are today, the steps that were taken to get us to that point really began with this period. So the Protestant Reformation definitely was an impactful series of events, whether you focus specifically on religion or not. I think that's where I'm going to finish things off for this video series. Thank you for joining me. I hope you found it informative and helpful. And at this point, I'll sign off. Thanks.